We also need to watch battery chemistries. I think with all of these changes, maybe we'll see more interest in sodium-ion technology or solid-state batteries to reduce reliance on imports of lithium iron phosphate cells for energy storage. Who knows? And I think maybe the biggest concern in the US is whether tariffs create inflationary pressures, and then worldwide, how trade wars impact global growth.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome back to the State of Play in Battery Metals on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Andrea Hotter, Special Correspondent at Fastmarkets. We'll be discussing the flurry of executive orders signed by President Trump as he returned to the White House this week, and what they may mean for the battery metals markets. Hello, Andrea. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me. It's very good to be back.
And it's great timing to have you here. This week, President Trump returned to the White House and signed a wave of executive orders with important implications for battery metals and critical minerals. So really appreciate you being here to help us make sense of it all. And I'd like you to walk us through what these executive orders and what they reveal about President Trump's attitude and approach to the sector may mean for the demand for electric vehicles and batteries, the supply and production of these battery metals and critical minerals, and of course, tariffs. But maybe first we could start off, what's the headline here?
Yeah, is it only the first week? I feel like so much has happened already. I think that's probably an indication that we definitely have a much more politically seasoned president than we did last time, who fully understands what he's doing now and how life on the Hill in DC works. So he's really hit the ground running. And as you said, we saw 42 executive orders on day one. I read through them all and cross-referenced them with the prior rulemaking that they were undoing and changing, and it's a lot. Obviously, some really important things for the natural resources sector. Some things are in and some things are out. So if you're oil and gas, or if you're in Alaska's natural resources sector, if you're an internal combustion engine car or uranium and rare earths, then you're probably in favor. And if you're an electric vehicle or it's charging infrastructure, you've got anything to do with climate change, including the Paris Climate Agreement, then you're out of favor. So if you're the Inflation Reduction Act, you're probably not really sure where you stand either way, but I'm sure we'll get to discussing that a little bit too. So it is quite hard to know what all this means in practice. We're seeing quite a lot of confusion. And as you said, the devil's going to be in the detail in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, and I wanted to get to the piece with the IRA because amongst these executive orders, President Trump directed U.S. federal agencies to immediately pause the disbursement of funds from the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. On Wednesday, his Office of Management and Budget clarified that the pause was to a narrower set of funding, but still included funding for climate change mitigation efforts and incentives for charging electric vehicles. Where will we start, in your opinion, to feel the effects of this freeze? And what does this mean for the future of the IRA and federal funding for climate and energy programs?
Well, the pause, as you say, is immediate, so it's already happening. I mean, according to some government agencies, they started freezing money for projects out of abundance of caution, not wanting to go against the new ruling just in case. But as you also said, it was then clarified that the executive order actually meant money for Green New Deal projects like electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. We still don't really know what this means for other projects related to mining, processing, technology, battery manufacturing, and so on, which are part of that Green New Deal. But I think it's really important to remember that billions of dollars have been promised for projects tied to the IRA and the infrastructure law. And if the president tries to block that funding permanently after this 90 days is up, he would be technically impounding money that Congress has appropriated, which I think inevitably would lead to a legal battle. But it's still very, very unclear. And I think also, just think about it this way, it would be a little bit strange to be promoting the US as a non-fuels natural resources producer and then completely cut off funding. And don't forget, also, I think this is a really important part, the vast majority of projects and jobs and that will be created and values created from the IRA from projects are located in Republican states. And so halting them potentially or even just slowing them down could have really serious economic and growth consequences. So the funding pause is also for 90 days. It doesn't mean it will last forever, but we do know that electric vehicles aren't getting any love from the new administration.
And that seems somewhat counterintuitive given the prominent role Elon Musk played in the Trump campaign and is playing in the new administration with the Department of Government Efficiency. Do you have any sense of or thoughts on why electric vehicles are getting so little love given that strong connection?
It's really interesting. I think Tesla is and Elon Musk is a bit of a wild card. My guess is that he's betting on his US rivals slowing down EV sales while he continues full steam ahead. And he hopes that any drop off in sales related to the loss of subsidies that we're going to see will be compensated for by Tesla being the go-to EV maker in the US. The end of tax credits effectively helps him to trim or slow down his competition. And he's also, I think he's been saying he's more focused on autonomous vehicles right now too. I'm really curious to see what Stellantis, Ford and General Motors think. They've spent a lot of money on electric vehicles. They've retrained their workers. They've signed joint ventures. They've built plants and factories. They've designed and sold cars. So have EV sales in the US slowed compared to China in the last couple of years? On the whole, yes. Could they slow further as a result of this executive order? Absolutely. But entirely unwinding investment in them, in my opinion, is highly unlikely, particularly as car companies know that the rules could potentially change again in 4 years after the next US election. But I definitely think there's going to be some jostling amongst the US automakers. And I think that the Elon Musk role is really interesting here too.
Yeah, and I think you said something very important when you said in the United States. We had Andy Home on last week, and he was commenting about how so much of the strong growth has been in China, and European EV sales actually fell last year as some notable subsidies were removed. And I'm curious, how do you think in this world where so much of the demand for electric vehicles and the production is growing so rapidly in China, how does that position the US automakers in this world we're moving into?
It's interesting. In terms of China, the Biden administration had already banned Chinese hardware and software from being used in the US in cars. And he also had imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and denied that $7,500 consumer EV credit that's been really important in the US to any vehicle that had made in China components. So they had kind of already closed the car door, excuse the pun, on Chinese technology as well as vehicles. So Chinese vehicles, really, EVs weren't really being sold in the US as it was. And I think Biden's actions mean new ones now can't be. We haven't seen any talk of reversing that. And I don't think we will, although there might be some exceptions. I think we have to wait and see whether US EV sales slow as a result in the US of all of this. One thing I keep hearing from people, perhaps less worried about their popularity, is that the US needs competition from China in order to improve its own EV offerings. They mention, and I think we've all seen at least pictures of really snazzy, sexy EVs in competition in China at all pricing points. And they think that the US should take some pointers from China and up its game a little bit. And that it really needs consumers to buy the car they want, even if it's Chinese. So I think it's an interesting time. Obviously, US buyers and consumers are not going to be able to access Chinese cars. Who knows if there'll be some exemptions, but I don't think we're going to see them in the States. But it doesn't necessarily move the US auto industry further in deeper into the electric vehicle sector by to any extent. Trump has called the new Green New Deal the Green New Scam, and he said he'd end the EV mandate on day one, which he said he would do, and he pledged to save the US auto industry, allowing US consumers to buy any car they want. They can, as long as it's not a Chinese one. Technically, there is no mandate related to electric vehicles. You can buy a car you want. However, as we've said, just not a Chinese one.
You said the president's moving quickly to implement what he's been talking about while he was out of office and on the campaign trail. And I thought maybe we could make our way back up the supply chain and talk about what the president may be doing in these executive orders on the production side for battery metals and critical minerals in the United States.
That's a really interesting one. There has been nothing very specific so far on battery raw materials, but we've definitely seen a continuation of this push to secure supply chains and diversify away from a reliance on nations outside the US, considered less friendly, including China. That's something that the Biden administration had been doing, and that's definitely something that the president now, Trump, had also worked towards in his first term. What he has said this week is that he wants to produce production of this, what he calls non-fuel minerals. And he mentioned rare earth. That was one that he was very quick to talk about. So I guess for me, what I'd like to know is what this means for financing for those projects under the IRA, because money has been a major stumbling block to all projects. He's also called for better geological mapping and, again, project financing for critical minerals. He mentioned critical minerals specifically, again, not saying what they were, but we know what the list is. Again, no mention of where that funding is going to come from. So one would assume that something like the IRA has got to play a role in this, whether it becomes renamed or we see something new in its place. Who knows? Again, that could take a long time. There are also plans to expedite permitting, which I think everyone on both sides of the aisle can agree is much needed and long desired. It can take over a decade, sometimes two, to get projects permitted, which is even including recycling ones, not just mines. We've heard through the executive orders, the president would like the US to look at working with Australia, India, and Japan in the US on projects, and that would include processing. And he's also said that the US would look at working with partners abroad in mineral-rich countries. No countries named, but we'll have to see who they are. They also mentioned shoring up the national defense stockpile with critical minerals, but nothing specific in terms of how or which minerals or what those stockpiles look like already. So there was no specific mention of battery raw materials. In a way, I'm not surprised. I feel like it would have been a little bit incongruous to talk about batteries given the public move away from electric vehicles. But there is still a need for energy storage. Look at the boom in data centers for AI that we're expecting to see. They're going to need energy. And if we're not using wind turbines, which are a definite no-no to the president, then we're going to need alternatives. Uranium and therefore nuclear is one way that we've heard the president would like to go as one of those options. But you can't get around storage in the nearer term because those projects like nuclear take a while. So we're going to have to wait for a few more specifics in terms of all of this. But I guess this is something that's going to come in the days ahead.
And I'm curious as well, this week as well, President Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. Obviously, electric vehicles and battery metals are key to an energy transition to a lower carbon economy powered by low carbon renewables. The president has a lot of support for traditional energy sources such as oil and gas. And I'm curious, for the people you cover on your beat, what's kind of the mood? Is there the positive of the president seems to be backing more production of everything? Or are they worried that there's going to be a strong shift back towards traditional energy sources like oil and gas?
Well, as he kept saying, we heard a lot during the election campaign and before taking office. drill, baby, drill. So we knew the focus was going to be very much on oil and gas. And I think the initial work there will be focused on encouraging oil and gas exploration and production on federal lands and waters. It's interesting, there was a lot of mention of Alaska. Obviously, that's a really key area for natural gas and oil, but also a state with a considerable amount of minerals, including nickel and copper, which haven't been developed. It's home to the Red Dog mine, which is a very large zinc mine that Teck Resources, a Canadian company, operates. I did talk this week actually to some Alaskan companies with projects in Alaska who have been waiting to get those projects off the ground. And they're really, really positive. They do, however, point to logistical issues and environmental opposition and indigenous community factors to consider. And they do agree those things don't go away. But the governor of Alaska is actually a very strong ally of the president, and he's really keen to grow the state's wealth from natural resources and quickly. So I think you're going to start to see a similar approach adopted around the country, not in Alaska. So I think if you're in the natural resources game and you're hoping to get a project developed, you're probably quite optimistic that you have at least got somebody in your corner who's saying that they want to do this. That doesn't mean that the Biden administration wasn't trying to do this, but I think that that very strong focus and mention of Alaska and natural resources has given at least some of these people a confidence that they're at least we're heading in the right direction. I think if you're in the oil and gas game, you're a safe bet right now. So I think that's going to be an interesting game to watch, but definitely the people I'm speaking to who are in terms of the mining side and who have projects, at least, they're optimistic that those projects are going to get a priority, especially if the US enters into a more kind of confrontational stance against some of its allies on the tariffs front.
I'd like to dig into the tariffs with you. This is a sector where we already have seen tariffs, so it's not like that's completely new. So maybe you could walk us through a little bit more of where do we stand now and what could be coming in way of tariffs?
Yes, tariffs. Well, that's a favorite word, isn't it? There have been a lot of tariffs being talked about, but nothing new has actually materialized yet. So there were a number of Biden era tariffs also imposed, particularly on China, a 25% tax on lithium ion battery imports, along with steel and aluminium products. Trump has previously said he would immediately impose a 25% tariff on all products entering the US from Canada and Mexico. And he actually signaled during a ceremony signing this week that that could be from February the 1st. He also said there could be an extra 10% tariff going on goods from China, and that would take those tariffs up to 60%. And he's also talked about a universal 10% tariff on all goods imported into the US, which he said would raise billions to reduce the deficit and allow the government to pay for social and industrial programs. A lot of these tariffs or threats of the tariffs appeared to be tied to stopping drugs and illegal immigration. So something of a bargaining tool, which makes me think everything's on the table. I did a kind of a rough back of the envelope calculation, and in theory, a 10% tariff on goods imported into the US based on 2023 imports would raise $310 billion. So it's a lot of money. Trump has said he plans to create an external revenue service to collect tariff money. So we do know something's potentially coming. We just don't know what, by how much, and when. It's quite interesting when we look at oil and gas. Trump had also threatened tariffs on countries if they didn't reduce their trade surpluses with the US, and he has used oil and gas as part of this. So we've seen a lot of Asian energy importers import more crude oil and LNG cargoes from the US. He's also been threatening the EU to buy more US energy or face tariffs. So we've seen the EU say it could look at buying more US LNG instead of Russian. So, right, you've got to think about long-term contracts. They can get in the way of this happening overnight. And obviously, there's a balancing act between staying competitive and pleasing the United States. But I think tariffs are going to have a really, really important role over the next 4 years.
And I'm curious if you've seen any market reactions in the markets you cover. I know in the gold market, concerns over tariffs have led to a widening of the price spread between gold in New York versus gold in London. And I was curious, when you look at the battery metals and critical minerals space, are you seeing any interesting price dynamics in the markets that you cover?
We haven't really seen anything dramatic in the market yet because nothing really has changed yet. Even though we're hearing all of these threats and all of this information regarding the IRA, nobody really knows what it means in terms of imports and pricing and compliance and so on yet. So producers had been looking at locking in premiums in their contracts for material that was IRA compliant and met requirements for production and storage in the US. So if we see IRA compliance rules end, does this push investment elsewhere? Does this end premiums for that material? If there aren't any more tax credits, does it open the US up to material that previously wasn't going there because it didn't earn tax credits under the IRA, or do tariffs stop that? A lot of Indonesian nickel, for example, is not IRA compliant because it has Chinese ownership, and that falls under the foreign entity of concern definition. So does that start to go to the US, or does that get tariffs imposed on it? We don't know. And even without tax credits under the IRA, are we going to see Western allies continue to work around China because they don't want to fall foul of tariffs if they do? So we don't know what that does to trade flows yet. Aluminium and steel are probably quite good examples to look at what did happen and what could happen. Canada and Mexico, they're obviously the most impactful areas for those aluminium and steel tariffs at the moment. I mean, it's a overlooked fact quite a lot that 3 out of 4 cars sold in the US contain aluminium from Canada. So it's really important. And actually this week during the earnings call, the Alcoa CEO said that the company thinks that US Midwest aluminium premiums will go, and he said substantially higher if 25% tariffs are imposed in order to attract volumes into the US. He didn't want to put a figure on it, but he said it could mean Canadian metal going to Europe and Middle Eastern and maybe Indian aluminium going to the US, which is effectively those ships that pass in the night, is how he put it, quite literally, on the Atlantic. So I think that's going to be a really important thing, but we just don't know yet not enough of the detail to know how things might be impacted in terms of the actual pricing.
So maybe I'll ask you some more things that we can't know yet, which is one of the things with tariffs is always how will other countries respond and who has the leverage, particularly in a world where China has just become so dominant in the production of battery metals, batteries, and electric vehicles. What do you think their response is? And does that have an impact on how far the president may push it with China? Does it end up being, does tariffs become more important to Canada and Mexico than China, perhaps?
You're absolutely right. Tariffs tend to lead to retaliatory actions. And we saw those countermeasures imposed in response to the tariffs on steel and aluminium during Trump's first administration. Trump imposed tariffs on aluminium and certain types of American steel. Canada also targeted whiskey and yogurt and coffee, and the EU whacked taxes on products from Bourbon to Harley Davidson motorcycles, quite famously. China also hit back against tariffs with its own taxes on imports of things like soybeans and pork, which were designed to weaken Trump's support among farmers. I don't know if you're a tequila drinker, Dave, but this time around, there's a threat of tariffs on Mexican tequila and beer that have been mooted. And Canada's also looking at tariffs on products including whiskey again, but also things like ketchup and licorice and toilet paper. So we might see another COVID era rush for toilet paper. And there's also this risk of the rerouting of goods when companies export products to the US relabeled by a third country with a lower import tariff, and the risk that that might grow if widespread tariffs are imposed. So that was common practice in recent years, and it led the President Biden to impose measures to prevent this on aluminium and steel imported from Mexico. And China, as you said, still has some very, very powerful weapons in its own arsenal, not least restrictions on products imported into the US. China has already crimped supplies to the US of critical minerals used in defense and semiconductors, such as gallium, germanium, antimony, and graphite. I think it could easily expand restrictions to other products that the US relies on if it's getting hit in the face by similar tariffs. So rarer, that would be a really important one. And it probably is why the president has mentioned rare earths so much this week during the inauguration speeches and also during the executive orders. So these tariffs, they definitely can go both ways.
And I would imagine in a world where you have so much uncertainty about policy and tariffs, as you said, it'll open up a lot of interesting arbs and create a lot of volatility and probably a lot of room for trading and a lot of wins and losses there. And I'm curious, as you talk to market participants, how are they responding to this policy shift coming out of the US and what it might mean going forward? How do you see it affecting the behavior of the people, the companies, and the markets that you cover?
I hate to say this, but I do think people are still in wait and see mode. It's really hard to do anything and lock in contracts for the year ahead when you just don't know what's going to happen. So that has been a real factor, I think, since the election. I had people say to me that they really did not know how to negotiate and what kind of contracts they wanted to or were prepared to sign. So I think people were doing a lot of business more hand to mouth than normal. We still don't know also what's going to happen with sanctions against Russia. The EU is looking at adding more sanctions on aluminium. President Trump is making some quite critical comments about the Russian president, which we didn't necessarily expect. So we don't know whether sanctions could get imposed and tightened in one way or the other. We don't know what is going to happen with these tariffs, as we've just been saying, what level they might be, what reciprocal tariffs might be imposed, and where that material is going to reroute as a result, what the impact on premiums will be, and also then, as you said, the arbitrage opportunities. So we don't also know what it's going to mean for demand and supply over the coming months. So I think it's really, really difficult to forecast. And in the meantime, we're just about to go into a holiday in China for the Lunar New Year. So things have been slowing down, which is another reason why we're in that traditional period where we might not see as much activity in China. And I think that's maybe that's masking some of the concern, but it's really, really, really hard for people. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, and I would think that, you've had a lot of the producers in particular outside of China in these metals sectors struggling. And one of the benefits that China has is there's been such an alignment through the government, through the supply chain of the direction they're moving in. And it sounds now like Western producers are kind of having to take a step back because you don't want to commit a lot of capital if there's just too much uncertainty about the future. So I'm curious, it seems like this could kind of tilt the odds against Western producers a little bit more. There's always a chance that the easier permitting, potentially some subsidies, some other things that are done can help give them a boost competitively. But it would seem like just the ambiguity has got to be making them pause a lot of decision making and lead to less investment in the near term.
I think it's interesting. I think you need to differentiate between producers investing in the US and companies outside the US. And I think, it was quite evident from some of the comments. Again, a lot of the producers are being quite cautious about what they say, but we've heard some of the Australian producers in their earnings this week, lithium companies say, well, the energy transition hasn't stopped just because of this. This is carrying on with or without the US. We are still pushing ahead with our projects. So I think once you've invested that capital, once you've committed to it, I think it's really hard to pull back, particularly in all of these massive projects abroad where you've got jobs reliant on it, you've got investment that's already happened, and you have your own targets to meet within those various countries. So to a certain extent, it's really important for the US market and for investment in the US, but you do have to look at the rest of the world as it's still really important to the energy transition. And the US might pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but all the other countries that are its signatories have not. and they still have their targets to meet. So I think we really need to be aware of that. And I think the other thing to think of is this material will just flow somewhere else. We saw during the Ukraine and Russia war, when that started, that material started to reroute, and you could do business with some countries and you couldn't do it with others. And we saw who would do business with who, and that material is still there. It's just going to different places that it did before. So I think a similar kind of thing will start to happen in terms of trade flows, in terms of projects and capital investment amongst producers. Yeah, it would probably give me pause if I didn't think that I was going to get tax credits and so on, and it's suddenly skyrocketed costs. But I think if you already made the investment and you're already committed, the money's in the ground and you're doing it, then, pausing that project, it would be hard to find a reason to. But again, anything's possible. Anything can happen. In theory, the US still wants to push ahead with its drive to procure and produce critical minerals for its supply chain. So it wants many of those to be produced domestically, which suggests that if you are a producer and you want to invest in the US, your money should be welcome. What form that takes, I don't know. Maybe the Inflation Reduction Act, like I said, maybe it gets renamed something else, because maybe it becomes the Trump Natural Resources Act. I don't know, but I'm being a little flippant here. All I'm trying to say is I don't think that push has gone away. I just think maybe it's become a little more politicized. And once we get over that, I think that you might find that the goals and ambitions are probably the same.
Well, I want to thank you, Andrea, for coming on the podcast and for helping us get our heads around what's happened so far. But before you go, I wanted to ask you, how are you thinking about this story and this sector and how it may evolve this coming year? Obviously, there's a lot that we need to learn, and, we're going to be figuring out as we go and the information comes in. But I was curious, are there certain events or actions that you're kind of gaming out and looking to as important signals or signposts that'll guide you and guide us on where the path might be going from here?
I'm thinking about it probably as I did during the first Trump administration, that anything can happen, and probably also to expect the unexpected. I do think the Ukraine war will be important because it could spell the end to sanctions in the US, although I'm not really sure that helps the US with oil dominance. If Russia resumes exports, we might see some tariffs there, but I do think that will be very, very interesting. I think we also need to watch battery chemistries. I think with all of these changes, maybe we'll see more interest in sodium-ion technology or solid-state batteries to reduce reliance on imports of lithium iron phosphate cells for energy storage. Who knows? I think, again, will we see some of the mines that have faced permitting issues in the US suddenly get the green light? There are quite a lot of them that are in litigation or have been waiting for years and years and years. So maybe that happens. I think we still need to remember that those environmental and community issues remain, and lawsuits are probably the biggest obstacle there is to this immediate overnight change. I think what all of this does to financing for ESG is going to be really interesting. We're seeing lots of banks and investors pulling back in this area. And so we all know that it all comes down to money in the end, and financing can be a real obstacle. So I think that's really, really important. And I think maybe the biggest concern in the US is whether tariffs create inflationary pressures, and then worldwide, how trade wars impact global growth. And I think a really interesting one for me personally, we talked about him earlier, it's the role of Elon Musk. At the moment, he's very much in with the president, and there's a possibility at some point that he's out. And we need to see what impacts that scenario or either of those scenarios will have. So I've kind of got my popcorn at the ready for that one.
Thanks again to Andrea Hotter, special correspondent at Fastmarkets. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of The State of Play in Battery Metals. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.